So this is the third instalment of the oxygen dissociation curves and haemoglobin. So this one we're going to look at different oxygen dissociation curves. So in relation to where an organism lives or their way of life. So just a summary of what we've learned so far. If the curve shifts to the left, that means the haemoglobin has a higher affinity for oxygen, so therefore it will take the oxygen up or load the oxygen more easily. So an example of something that would have a high affinity would be fetal haemoglobin or organisms at high altitude, because they are more interested in getting as much oxygen as possible into their blood. Another example would be myoglobin. And then on the other hand, if the curve shifts to the right, this is known as the Bohr effect. If an organism is exercising vigorously, etc. And the Bohr effect means that the haemoglobin will have a lower affinity for oxygen. It means that the oxygen is released more easily, and it usually happens when there's a high carbon dioxide concentration. If it's high carbon dioxide, that will dissolve in the blood to make the pH lower, make it more acidic, which changes the shape of the haemoglobin to make it have a lower affinity. So you tend to find lower affinity haemoglobins in metabolically active organisms or ones that the muscles are very active. So as an example of something that has a high affinity for oxygen is a lugworm. So lugworms spend a lot of the day with the tide over the sand on the shore, so that's fine. But when the tide goes out, the lugworm just basically has to survive on a tiny little pocket of water in a little burrow. So obviously throughout the day, that burrow is going to deplete, the water in that burrow is going to deplete of oxygen, progressively get less and less oxygen throughout the day until the tide comes back in. So that lugworm, while it's trying to survive off a little bit of oxygen, will need to have a high affinity for oxygen. So you can see here that this is the partial pressure of oxygen in the burrow, and the lugworm has a much higher affinity for oxygen at that partial pressure than the human haemoglobin. So it means that lugworm haemoglobin can take up oxygen more easily. It has a higher affinity for oxygen. On the other hand, mice are very metabolically active. They are very small animals, so therefore they have a large surface area to volume ratio. So they're going to lose a lot of heat throughout the day. So they're going to have to eat a lot and also generate a lot of heat to keep them warm, which will require a lot of respiration, which will require a lot of oxygen. So they have a high metabolic rate. They are quite active also, and because they are small, they have a large surface area to volume ratio, so they lose a lot of heat, so they'll have to respire a lot to generate heat to keep them warm, which all requires oxygen. So they will need to give the oxygen to their muscles. They don't live in an environment where oxygen is short, so that's fine. They can get as much as they like, but what they really need to do is give that oxygen to the tissues. They need to unload it to the tissues. So the curve will move to the right, because that means that it has a lower affinity. The haemoglobin has a lower affinity for oxygen, which means it's going to give it off more to the tissues, which is an advantage, so that mice's tissues can respire more, especially if it's a muscle tissue, can move around, but also they can respire more to generate heat. So mouse haemoglobin shifts to the right, so it has a lower affinity for oxygen, therefore it'll give that oxygen to the tissues more readily. It will unload it more readily. Other things that will have a curve that shifts to the right is anything that is quite active. So swimming fish, because they are constantly needing oxygen for their muscle contraction, they will have a lower affinity for oxygen. It will move to the right. Also flying in birds, because they're very active, that means that the Bohr shift is going to move to the right, so that it has a lower affinity for oxygen to give off the oxygen to the tissues. And also birds as well are warm-blooded. They will need to maintain their body temperature, So they'll have quite a high metabolic rate, so they will need a lot of oxygen in their tissues. So the haemoglobin will have a low affinity for oxygen, so it will give that oxygen, unload the oxygen to the tissues for respiration. So just as like a quick quiz, so we've got here a lugworm and a pigeon. So the lugworm lives in little burrows of water which has low levels of oxygen. So what that lugworm wants is to take up as much oxygen as possible. Therefore, it will have a high affinity for oxygen, so that curve is going to move to the left. This pigeon is metabolically active. It's warm-blooded, so it needs to respire a lot, so therefore it's going to move the curve to the right. So this one's going to be the pigeon, so that it has a lower affinity for oxygen, so it's going to give the oxygen to the tissues. Another example, you've got mice and a llama. Well, llamas live at high altitudes, so therefore their struggle is getting enough oxygen, so they want to take up as much oxygen as possible, so that curve is going to move to the left, so it has a higher affinity so that they can load as much oxygen into the haemoglobin as possible. Mice are very metabolically active. They have a high metabolic rate, so therefore they will have a lower affinity for oxygen. The curve is going to move to the right so that the oxygen is given to the tissues more readily, or it's unloaded at the tissues. And that's the end.